English, you know, there's probably ever been. The author of Hybrid Tapestries, The Development of Pakistani Literature in English, editor of the forthcoming In the New Century, an anthology of Pakistani literature in English. Her previous anthology, And the World Changed, received the Gold IPPY and Bronze Forward Awards in the United States. She's contributed memoir essays to leading publications. Mine might not be leading, but even I have benefited from her memoir essays. And among many other accolades, she is bibliographic representative, Pakistan, for the Journal of Commonwealth Literature, which I edited for over a decade. So Maniza and I go way back. And she has served on literary juries, including the KLF Gets Farmer Award, which was given to Mohsen Hamid very recently. And she was regional chair Eurasia of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and regularly contributes to the Pakistani press. So since our panel, Muneeza, is called Coming of Age, Pakistani English Language Literature, then I just wanted to ask you this opening question. Do you think Pakistani writing in English has really come of age, and what does that even mean?
Oh, that's a complicated question. Yes, well, I think it's come of age, yeah. Come of age, it came in, I don't know whether the come of age is a term, it's been coming into its own gradually. Well, for the last 20, 30 years. I mean, it wasn't given much cognizance at first, and it didn't have a modern voice. I mean, Babsi gave it a modern voice. She was and Zulfikar Ghaus before that, but we didn't have any, when Zulfikar Ghaus was doing wonderful work, we didn't have enough interaction between the diaspora and Pakistan, and we didn't have, I mean, it's also got to do with how concepts have changed. Like Zulfikar Ghaus wrote about the murder of Aziz Khan, which was set in Pakistan, so everybody said, oh, that's a Pakistani novel. But when he wrote about Brazil, everybody said, oh, he's writing about Brazil, he's not really Pakistani, he lives in diaspora. But actually, his Brazilian trilogy, it draws on his Pakistani experience. I mean, critics have now said that the Brazilian trilogy is murder of Aziz Khan on a larger scale. I mean, the world is kind of interlinked. We now see links between countries, how certain countries have certain kind of history. We see how diaspora writing and Pakistani writing, they also have a link. The voice, I'm sort of talking about why a lot of people say, why do you include people living in the diaspora? Because some of them, of course, are brought up in Pakistan, some have been brought up in England, but the fact is they are a voice of the minority, of the marginalized, not now they're coming into the mainstream. So whether you're actually writing from Pakistan or whether you're writing as a diaspora writer, that writing is being given cognizance. I'd like to make a sort of slide. Someone asked me yesterday why I started on this subject, and the reason why I started on this subject was I grew up in England. I went to school there, and frankly, there was absolutely nothing about my country except for Kipling and E.M. Foster, and that had nothing to do with the world in which I inhabited. So I started looking at this literature, and now, as more and more literature is produced, I realize how these works challenge that narrative, or how they engage with it. And so coming of age or coming into its own has really got to do with establishing a voice for yourself the world over, and finding the links not only in your own country, but between the world, because we live in a global world which is interlinked. Thank you.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Muneeza. Moving to Taha. Taha Kehar is a novelist, journalist, and literary critic. A law graduate from SOAS, London, Taha is the author of 3 novels, No Funeral for Nazia, which I just completed reading and really enjoyed, from 2023, Typically Tanya, 2018, and Of Rift and Rivalry from 2014. He's also the co-editor of The Stained Glass Window, Stories from the Pandemic from Pakistan, and as you know, I'm kind of obsessed with COVID, so I reviewed that for Dawn. So luckily, I'm getting quite familiar with your work by now. Found it really compelling. Kehar has served as the head of the Express Tribune's Peshawar City pages and bi-monthly books page, and he worked as assistant editor on the op-ed desk at the News. And based in Karachi, he teaches undergraduate media and social sciences courses. So we are lucky to have you on the panel, Taha. And I guess I wanted to ask you, because Maniza really kicked us off so well with that history and some of those early figures like Zulfikar Ghosh and Bapsi Sidhwa. You're our sole millennial representative, so I wonder what the perspective looks like from the younger generation, from millennials and Gen Z. It's quite a different scene now. What do you feel about this coming of age of Pakistani writing in English?
So I don't usually identify as a millennial, but okay. I am a millennial, but I don't identify as one. As far as this topic is concerned, coming of age for Pakistani English literature, I feel we've come of age across time and space. You could say 20 years ago we came of age, and you could say now we've come of age as well, but I think that's somewhat immaterial. Everyone who has written and contributed to the canon has added a unique and refreshing voice. And what I feel at the moment is that we are at a stage when we're exploring genres. Someone like Bina Shah is now writing sci-fi. We have Usman Malik working with speculative fiction. We also have Kamila Shamsie, who did a complete reimagining of Antigone, and her most recent novel, Best of Friends, which, as a reader of Sally Rooney, I felt she was combating that vision, which I thought was very interesting. But we're working with different genres at the moment, and that is what is interesting about it. It's not that we're breaking away from literary fiction. It's very much intact, but that experimentation in itself is compelling. So yeah.
So next we have Maniza Naqvi, is a novelist, essayist and short story writer. Her latest novel, The Inn, unfolds through characters who are doctors, drone operators, development specialists, spies and professors, deeply confused about their quote-unquote goodness and caught in the system of empire. Maniza's earlier published novels are also political: Mass Transit, On Air, Stay With Me, A Matter of Detail, Sarajevo Saturdays, which is a collection of her short stories and poems. Her short stories are also included in several anthologies. Her book, A Guest in the House, is a memoir which chronicles her time at the Pioneer Bookhouse, Karachi, and provides a lens into the history of the city. Her storytelling of this memoir will be on the Moth Radio Hour in March. She's also the founder and CEO of the Little Book Company, a startup e-book digital platform for publishers, authors, and booksellers. And the Little Book Company has recently started a podcast. So, Muneeza, with your most recent novel, The Inn, that I said more about than any of the others, because it's the one I know the best, can you tell us a bit more about The Inn's portrayal of contemporary America and contemporary geopolitics, really? You centre on people who consider themselves liberals and progressives, but in fact in their practice they do enable a kind of fascism. And it's about those who resent that and continue to want to be a part of it, and they do benefit from it. So I guess what future do you see for the so-called clash of civilizations between the US and Muslim cultures, and for geopolitics more broadly?
Well, I'd rather speak about the novel and how it fits into what Muneeza was talking about, that, you know, the writing from South Asian authors has come of age, and it is no longer just dealing with what we did in our summer vacation when we came back to Pakistan, or talking about our elite lives. But the novel now that's being written by South Asians, and particularly by Pakistani authors, is taking on the world and how the world is organized. And in today's world, we have a clear, absolute clarity now, in the last 3 months, if there was any doubt at all about how the world is organized. We are seeing it in Gaza. We are seeing the genocide and the apartheid being played out in full view of everyone in real time. And no one can do anything about it except wear a scarf. Okay? My book, The Inn, is about the kind of mentality that makes that possible. The entitlement, the sheer belief in our goodness and our superiority that makes that possible, that makes that blindness possible, right? So that is what I'm writing about. And Palestine, the reason that so many of us really cling to the concept of struggle through the prism of Palestine is because Palestine is that one struggle that really illustrates all struggles, all occupation. And my book, The Inn, is the mirror, I hope that I've accomplished that shows the faces of the people that make that possible, including us. So it is, the protagonist is a Pakistani doctor, and he's caught up in trying to belong in this sort of club of people, but at the same time, he has enormous resentments towards them for what they do to his homeland, which is Pakistan, or how they view the rest of the world. So it's about the cognitive dissonance that happens in a post-colonial world, which isn't really post-colonial at all, right? So that is what I'm trying to do with this latest novel of mine, and I think I've been trying to do it with all my works, but this one sort of crystallized it.
And last but not least, Salman Tarek Kureshi is a Karachi-based English language poet, writer, and columnist. Kureshi's poems have been published over the years in magazines in the US, Britain, and of course Pakistan. They have also appeared in anthologies, Pieces of Eight, 1971, Legacies of the Indus, 1974, The Blue Wind, England, 1985, Maniza's Dragonfly in the Sun, 1998, an anthology, 1998, The Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, was that 2011, and a solo volume, Landscapes of the Mind, from OUP in 1998. Some of his poems and short stories have been published in the Pakistan Journal of Literature and the Aleph Review. Salman has consistently appeared at KLF since its inception and is presently on the KLF Advisory Committee. And I think we're very lucky to have you, Salman. We needed that poetry perspective for sure on a panel like this one. So I wanted to ask you about the condition of Pakistani poetry in English. So could you tell us more about that? You're also at any point welcome to read your poetry. I know we'd benefit from hearing that. So just over to you on poetry.
Poetry, Anglophone poetry, I think was the initial better known form or genre or style of writing in Pakistan. That's for a short period. Today, I think the Pakistani novel is a lot better known than my minor craft. Poetry, however, just to touch a bit on that issue of finding its own voice, it's really a question of finding multitudes of voices that have individuality and that are as varied as voices around the world are. not derivative. They are original. Just as a small side note, many years ago, I found in my father's old papers a copy, a 1930s sometime copy of the Ravi magazine, which was brought out by Government College Lahore, where I also studied. And my father had once been an editor of the Urdu section of the Ravi. This happened to have some poems in English section by the great poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz in English. Two of them. Faiz, interestingly, was the editor of the English section of the Ravi. And Faiz Sahab they had these two poems there. And, well, let's say they are not amongst his finest or greatest work. Yes, they were very polished, but they had that kind of fantasy, romanticism, distant romanticism that was probably brought down by Professor Eric Dickinson, who was the professor of English in his day and who was a total late Victorian romantic in his taste, which was echoed there. Now, Faiz, fortunately, abandoned that kind of writing and went on to the much, much better, of course, he's a great poet. Point of saying it is, this was derivative. And there are a number of writers from that period, in the 50s, even to the 60s, who were echoing modes that they thought were the way to write. I think the first really individual voices that cropped up here, and I need to just mention them very quickly, there was a number of them. Zulfikar Ghaus, of course, that's where I would start. And Zulfikar Ghaus, although his connection to Pakistan is tenuous. He was born in what is now Pakistan, but he lived in what was then India, and what is now India for that matter. And then he moved to the United Kingdom, where he lived many years, where I met him actually. And then from the UK, he moved to, from London, he moved to South America eventually, where he lived the rest of his life, most of his life. Yet his style, I think, brought many of us into what I would call an individual, then 20th century style of writing. I think they would include Tawfiq Rafat, Maki Kureshi, that generation, Kaleem Umar, a wonderful writer. They all were very different from each other. They were all struggling to find an original expression.
They just say we're American or British. The thing that interests me, for example, is I have read a book, and it's a very good book, on Hanif Kureshi. And of course, Hanif Qureshi's whole argument was, I am British born, and he fought this battle. But he is very happy to take part in anthologies on Pakistani English literature. And this book says, you know, he's British, and they completely overlook his Pakistani inheritance. And if you look at his work, he's engaging with his uncle, with Umar Qureshi. He engages with him all the time. One of his novels has a quote which is a sort of version of Maki Kureshi. He was very aware of his Pakistani inheritance, which was literary, and it influenced him. So you can't actually deny that inheritance, although when there are other complications about Hanif, because this is the other narrative over here, is that English is the language of the elite. Well, okay, but in England it is not the language of the elite, it's the language of everybody. Now, when British Asian writers write about working class life, a lot of people in Pakistan say, oh, they're just pandering to stereotypes, you know, they don't relate to that life. But actually that life is being expressed. So it broadens the whole horizons of Pakistani English literature. And actually what I wish is much more of it would be translated.
Thank you. Taha.
I suppose our identities are very complex, if you think about it, whether you live in Pakistan or you belong to the diaspora. Your identities are fundamentally very complex, and you're navigating very different spaces as people. So if, for instance, you're a writer living in the West, anywhere, whether it's London or in New York, you're a skilled cultural navigator. You carry your Pakistani lineage with you. You also have to engage with your surroundings, and that impacts your writing. It may not necessarily impact the language you choose to write in, but it impacts your sensibilities. And I think, as someone who lives in Pakistan, I also read a lot of diasporic fiction. I enjoy it thoroughly. And I don't say that they pander to the West, because there is a reality and a validity to whatever is being written. So that's what it is.
I haven't fully formed this thought in my head, so maybe I shouldn't speak it, but what the heck. I think something really interesting is happening with writers of Pakistani heritage who are born in the US or in the UK or in France or whatever, and also who are still here. I think they or we are all occupying this in-between space that can't be defined as this or that. We are this and we're that, and we're in the middle, and we're up there and here and everywhere. And we can speak and emote and think and feel and love from many different directions. And I guess in this world that we live in, that likes to categorize everybody, I think they found a category, I think it's called queer, and I think it means something very specific, but that's not what I mean. I mean, it's everything, and that's why I think authors from this part of the world that are occupying the world are so interesting right now, because they're meeting the moment. They can speak for so much and so many people and what so many people are feeling. And I think it may be something that was always the case, because you can see that, for example, many of the thinkers and writers of the 20th century who are leftist happen to be of Pakistani descent in Europe and in the US and elsewhere. And I think that's because we bring this vast, huge heritage, which is colonial, which is anti-colonial, which is everything. So I think that's, what would you say? Do you think?
I suppose we belong everywhere. That's what it is. We are navigating different identities and different spheres of influence, maybe, to use that very awkward term, but we just...
And different emotions.
Different emotions. Different emotional landscapes and political landscapes, right, perhaps. Yeah.
And Salman, this is your idea.
Maniza has just said this all-encompassing. But it's, is there such a thing? I think I've been asked that question previously, not just now, but it's relevant to this. Is there a Pakistani voice in poetry that has often been in so-called Pakistani art? This came up. It was claimed by Tawfiq Rafat that his work represented Pakistani art. I still have not found out in what way. Although Tawfiq is a wonderful poet, he's come and he's gone, and he wrote tremendous stuff. A certain toughness in the sinews, was he implying? A certain earthiness, was he implying? Yes, but that's not where it ends. course, poetry reflects its environment. It must reflect its environment. If the environment is Pakistan, it will reflect Pakistan. If its environment is the United States, it will reflect the United States. Very simple. If it does anything else, then if the environment is the moon, as one day it might be, it will reflect the lunar landscape. That's not the issue. The point was Pakistani art, and I think the whole point of contemporary, the present, what I call finding their voice, is that they're writing poetry. Not necessarily all the younger people today, and many others, such as old-timers also, are writing poetry, and not necessarily this poetry or that poetry or this region or that region. We're writing verse. And that's what the verse is about, anything and everything. And it's written in many different forms, many different formats, and there are many different genres, ideas, and style, and all are relevant. I just wanted to make a particular mention on the program, this KLF. There's this, what is it, this performance poetry thing that's been the program was yesterday, what was it, the youth poetry. Now, I was asked what I thought of it, and I think it's relevant to us today. Yes, that's poetry also. Not my kind, maybe not your kind, anything, but it is poetry and it is relevant. There's no harm in that. It is poetry in the same sense as hip-hop music is music alongside Beethoven.
I want to pick up on a couple of things that people have said. Maniza, you said about we're post-colonial, but we're not post-colonial at all, which really struck me. And also, Muneeza, you were talking about the whole issue of writing in English and, you know, the charge of elitism, of pandering to the West, this idea of apologist literature. So it's a question, since our panel is all about English language literature, you know, how much have we actually moved, you know, since the colonial period? I'm thinking about African writers like Chinua Achebe, who chose to write in English but to bend the language and change it and experiment with it. Salman Rushdie also did that, and many, many others. And then there's Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote in English and then made the decision to switch to Gikuyu and rejected English, and did see it as elitist and a colonial hangover. And so I'm just really interested in the perspective from English language Pakistani writers in the year 2024, and, you know, what you feel about writing in English, what sort of response you have, and what alternatives or what translation possibilities, if any, that you see. So I know it's a big question, but I'm sure you all have different angles. Maniza.
I'll take it first. I think just tying it in with what Salman said about what is poetry, right? If it's relevant and in today's world, I'd just add to that, and I'd say that if it touches your heart, then it's poetry. If it moves you to act, it's poetry. Like Faiz Ahmed Faiz's poetry. It moves you to act and to feel part of something bigger, to feel hope, then it's poetry. Now, whether it's in English or whether it's in Urdu or Sindhi or Balochi or Punjabi or Pashto or French or whatever, Spanish, you should express yourself in whatever language you can. If you are able to write in English, and that's the only medium you can write in, you write in English. If Urdu or Sindhi or Balochi or Pashto or Punjabi is your medium that you feel strong in, you use that. but write or express yourself. If you feel that it's your body with which you express yourself, then you dance, but express. I, unfortunately, can only write in English. So I write in English, right? I didn't choose to write in English, but that's what I can do. And I'm specifically speaking to the younger people who I don't know if they're here by choice or by force, but this is what I want to tell you, that it's not by choice that we write in English, it's because that's what we were taught to write in.
Well, I agree with Maniza on this, that it is not often a choice. I write in English because it's the only language I can write in. My mother wrote in Urdu because it was the only language she could write in. And she would, I mean, she spoke English, she would have passed out if somebody said write in English. She would have said, I can't, end of story. So, but there are people, I mean, I'm actually very fascinated by people who have command over both languages, and people like Haris Khaliq, who writes in Punjabi, he writes in Urdu, he writes in English. And I wish we could ask him what makes him choice, but I know, they say that certain languages offer you a certain option and that one language doesn't, but you need to ask a multilingual writer that. The other thing that is interesting is this sort of communication between languages, or movement between languages. Of course, we have people like Salman Rushdie, Ahmad Ali, who experimented with the English language and tried to bring the Urdu aspect into it, or the way we speak. But actually in poetry, what you've now got is people writing ghazals and qasidas, and actually they're experimenting with different forms. Actually in poetry, other than ghazals and qasidas, you've got them expanding this globally. Again, you've got Athar Tahir, who's done a whole book in haiku. Anish Shivani has done a whole book of sonnets. Maki Kureshi also wrote sonnets. You've got, this is Shadab Hashmi is doing ghazals, she's done qasidas. And of course her great mentor was Agha Shahid Ali, who was actually my daughter Kamla's great mentor in America. He was her professor. But he introduced the ghazal, and what they were looking for in the ghazal was they found it in Spanish poetry of a Spanish poet from Andalusia who was trying to reclaim this poetic form which had been part of Europe 700 years ago. So in writing the ghazal and the qasida, they're partly moving across into Urdu and partly moving into Europe's Muslim history. And I find that very fascinating.
So when I write in English and I show my work to someone, a friend usually, they'll say, okay, that's great, but when will you write this in Urdu? I don't have the skills to do that. I could try, but it'll take me longer than it would take me to write an English novel. And I don't have the proficiency that Kuratullah and Heather had to write Aag Ka Darya in Urdu and then translate it into English. But I just believe language is a tool for expression. If you feel comfortable in a particular language, that is what you should write in. And it shouldn't be imposed in any way. All of us don't write in English because it was imposed on us by some colonial master. It's just something we are a bit more comfortable with. And as far as writing in another language is concerned, the writer Amir Hussain a few years ago started writing in Urdu, and he believes that it has enriched his English prose as well in many ways. He writes shorter prose now. It's interesting how one language can affect another language and how you bring the sensibilities of the creative sensibilities of one language into another. I was recently translated into Russian, which I thought was ridiculous because I don't know why people want to read it. But seeing those words on the paper, I don't know how to read the language, but I know it has a life of its own there. I believe Jhumpa Lahiri wrote in Italian to escape the hegemony of English in her lied because she felt there were certain things she received. That she received a Pulitzer Prize for her short fiction, and she felt she didn't deserve it. And she wanted to just break away from that stranglehold. And she did it well. She wrote an entire novel recently, and it's completely different from what she would have written in English. And she translated that, again, with the skill of someone like Kuratullah and Heather, and produced something different. So there are possibilities of finding one work, finding a completely different life in a completely different shape, size, and meaning in another language. So that's what I feel. Yeah.
It's interesting. You mentioned Amir Hussain, because he is one of the people that has in recent years moved back and forth between languages. But one of his characters said, you don't choose the language you write in, it chooses you, which is what a lot of you are saying. And the Jhumpa Lahiri example is interesting as well, because she's trying to write in a third language. And I don't know if you know Julien Colombo, who's French and writes in Urdu. So it's a very complex issue, and I wonder, Salman, what the view is from poetry and how much interaction there might be between different languages. English at the forefront, but Urdu and regional languages as well.
We're talking about English. I don't think anybody chooses the language they write in. Very few have that felicity in a number of languages that they would choose which to write in. It comes of itself. There are not many Nabokovs in this world. There are not many Joseph Conrads who chose what they wrote in. For that matter, not many Samuel Beckett's. You come here, here you have a choice, because many are equally proficient in a number of languages. We have, amongst the English language poets in Karachi, in Pakistan rather, he's from Islamabad, Haris Khaliq, who writes in English, who writes in Urdu, and who has written in Punjabi, and perfectly adequately in all three languages. Is that the way to go? I don't know. I'm comfortable with English, and I think English has certain inherent advantages as a poetic language. Its sheer vocabulary. You look for a word, a shade of meaning, a shade of rhythm, actually alliteration, certain kind of music. You find it in English, possibly with greater felicity than other languages. The sound is less likely to dictate the sense you want. So therefore, it's, to my mind, easier, but that's a rationalization after the fact. The fact I was brought up speaking in English, and I was educated in an English language institution, and yes, English has, rightly or wrongly, the connotations of an elite language, so it's a language of power in this society. And therefore you're likely to learn it as much as any other language, more than many other languages, or choose to learn it. But writing in it, I said, I had no choice. I wrote in English from the beginning. I've tried writing in Urdu with little success.
Is it on? Yeah. I tried to translate my memoir, one of, a guest in the house. I tried to translate that myself into Urdu before Sayyid Kashif Raza took it out of my hands and said, I'll do it for you. Stop torturing us. And, but when I was translating it into Urdu myself, I found it deepened my ability to, it changed parts of what I had written in English, because somehow the Urdu, because it is my mother tongue, that's what my parents speak, And that's where I think the emotional connection really is, that it made the language in English more beautiful when I tried to say the same thing to myself in Urdu. And then I took the Urdu and put it back into English. Just deepened the effect. So I'll own up to that. But can I write in Urdu? No, I can't. You know, can I speak in Urdu? Yes. I could maybe do an audio book. You know, I don't know. So.
Let me ask one more question before opening up for your questions, which is just about, you know, I unfairly asked you, Taha, about the view for millennials, and you don't even identify as millennial. So let me just ask everybody how things are changing by this point of the 21st century. Salman, I was struck, you were talking about performance poetry, but there's also Insta poetry, people like Rupi Kaur. I'm thinking of collaborative novels as well, so it's not just poetry. You know, this one that Margaret Atwood has brought out that is sort of, again, COVID-y, that's been, you know, by a dozen writers, and we don't know who has written what chapter. That's kind of an interesting innovation. And then poor Hanif Kureshi, whose name's come up quite a lot, but we haven't mentioned this terrible accident and his paralysis, and how he's using Substack to produce really evocative and powerful pieces. And those are just some examples off the top of my head. So I just wonder what your thoughts are. And Maniza, maybe also publishing, because you're doing so much since you were talking about a guest in the house and Pioneer Book House. So just what is happening in 2024, both in publishing and in performance and on the page? You know, how is it all changing on the keyboard, on the screen?
You know, I'm not an academic, so I can't speak to the whole canon of writing that's happening now, but I can say that I think it's all being exploded. Language itself is just being explored and reinvented and exploded by a new generation of writers. And that's what I see. And they are connecting, in our case, Urdu and Persian and Arabic and everything else, and English, and mixing it all together and coming up with a new way of expression. And we see that in poetry, and we see it in novels. Salman Rushdie did that a long time ago. You know, he did that with a book, not to be mentioned, but as people fell from the sky, they were metamorphosizing and changing and beyond recognition. And I think in a way, to me, that was that explosion of language and culture and expression, that the world was colliding and shifting and changing, so that language itself was morphing into something else. I think we are in that moment now.
So I think good literature is a celebration of experiences. And I think with globalization, with social media, our attention spans are also very limited. And simultaneously, the width of our experience is very, very vast. So if you think about it, that's impacting language, the way we communicate ideas. You mentioned Insta poetry. I would say with that 280 character limit on Twitter and 300 or more words on Instagram, you have to find a way to be brief and concise. You have to be able to communicate ideas effectively. And it's impacting fiction in a way because you want to be read. I was told that you're in constant collision with Netflix as a writer. Nobody will read you. They will just wait for the film that will never come because nobody will make a film on your book, so you'll never be read. So make your fiction easily accessible, make it interesting, make it a reflection of social experiences, and that is what it is fundamentally. So,
my thought is actually more on, I mean, I agree with both Maniza and Taha, or what they say of this complexity. But what has happened in 2020, and it's been happening, is that you're getting access to readers you never had before. Without the internet, I mean, in Pakistan, this I have seen, you could hardly get any new books. And now, anyone you want, and if you want to download it, you download it. You don't wait for it to go through the censor and the, packages being disappearing and all this kind of thing. You just download it, and you get access. You hear about a single book, you can look it up. And so that has made a big difference also to the writing and to the who you're reaching out to.
Thank you. I think you just plugged me. Thank you. Yes, I think Muneeza just gave a lovely plug for the Little Book Company, which is an e-book company. You just download it and you read it.
Oh, quite right, yeah. It is a great, it's a great initiative, by the way.
Product placement, I know we have lots of questions, so we'll start with the gentleman here. Is there a mic, please?
Thanks. My name is Arif Zaman, and Claire would be remiss of me not to say that I'm a University of York alum. So my question is around continuity and change. And Maniza, you won't be surprised by me asking this question. But we know that in pre-partition times, there were women, Muslim women, who were writing in English. And one of the things that we know also is the concerns of public and private, purge and polygamy, were also written about. Iqbal Anisa Hussein's book, which came out after 75 years in 2019, you can get it in OUP over here, was an example of talking about arguing for Muslim women's education, expressing reservations about religious practices that confine women to the domestic sphere. So my question is, this was happening. It was happening before 47. It was happening here in what was then, of course, India. And yet, there is still a great deal of ignorance around that. It's getting better, but there's more that needs to be done. So and especially when they were writing about issues that were very relevant today, issues of poverty and inclusion and all of these issues. So my question is, what can be done to ensure there is much greater understanding and connectivity with not only those individuals like Iqbal Anisa Hussein and others, but also better appreciation of the thinking and ideas that can perhaps better inform contemporary and current debates in Pakistan, in Karachi, and indeed in London and New York? Thank you.
That's a complicated question. Well, I mean, there needs to be much more looking at older work, which we don't seem to be, we're getting very sort of, I mean, generally we're very, well, because new work is so exciting, but we do need to look at the older work, at what the older writers were aiming for. One of the issues, it was pre-colonial, but it carried on even after post-colonial times, was this whole thing of why are you writing in English? And that was a big crisis because it was supposed to be communicating to the colonials and therefore represent, either you were, in the 19th century, you were trying to emulate the colonials, and so you got all this sort of rather flowery kind of English coming out, and which was often dated. The Romantics had been and gone, and everybody was trying to write like the Romantics, this kind of thing. But by the 1930s and 1920s, because of the independence movement, things were changing. And you did get works of Ahmad Ali's work, your grandmother, she's your grandmother, isn't it? Walid Hussain, whose work I discovered. And actually it was only, I must tell you, when I was only talking to him, yes, when I was only talking to him, I discovered, oh, I knew her daughter and she lived next door to my aunt, and I had no idea. I'd read about Iqbal Nisa Hussain, I had no idea of her background. She was a fascinating writer who wrote about life, parda and polygamy, it was, in a Muslim household. And it was a wonderful book. And it's now been revived. So it's very important that books like these are revived. We certainly need to look at Ahmad Ali's Twilight in Delhi. It's always out. Also his Urdu stories. his engagement, the Angare stories are fascinating, although they have been re-examined now. But there are a lot of other writers from that time who need to be, well, I'm trying to think, other than the well-known ones who brought modernity in, we actually need to look at the old-fashioned ones also, where we think that they...
And Taha had mentioned Karatalin Haider, who's not as early, but I think a very good example. So this is great. Are there any other questions? Yes. Mike over here, please. Oh, you got it.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Asad. I am engineer by profession. I have two questions in a row which have very basic in nature. My first question is, do languages has any interaction or linkages with genes? And my second question, if someone knows more than one languages, but the thought process remains in single language, how we can identify this? How we can say about this?
So if I get you right, the first question is about language and its relationship with change, and the second one, sorry, genetics, okay. And the second one, if you have more than one language, then the thought process, working between, yeah. Great, thank you for repeating.
I have an answer to your second question. I suppose there's a language you think in, and the language that is the language of your soul, and I think that is the language you dream in. So ask that question. Which language are you dreaming in? Which language are not only your thoughts in, because we're trained to think in 2 or 3 languages, but the language you dream in. And it's not just actually going to sleep and the dreams and nightmares you have, but the aspirations that you have, which language truly encapsulates all of those elements. And as far as language and its connection to change is concerned, language is constant. Genes. Well, I think you can easily defy your genes and write in a completely different language. Didn't your mother write in Urdu?
My mother wrote in Urdu.
Yes.
My grandmother wrote in Urdu.
And
they
you
all
write
wrote
in
in
English?
Urdu. My chachi wrote in English, and she was... And, oh, by the way, the interesting argument I used to always hear, to go off a tangent slightly when we're talking about older writers and this whole debate about English, was when I was younger, this thing about English should only be used non-creatively, propaganda was, they used to compare Atiyah Hussain and Qurratan-e-Ain Haider and say, you see, they were both bilingual. Qurratan-e-Ain Haider wrote in Urdu, and Atiyah wrote in English, and Qurratan-e-Ain Haider was at that time well known. But of course, now Atiyah Hussain is a pioneer. But at that time, the debate was that, you see, you should write in Urdu. I find that very fascinating because my aunt's first language was English.
My Nana was an Urdu writer, and his granddaughter can barely speak Urdu.
Yes, well, that's...
But his granddaughter also writes. Okay. The point is to write.
Yeah.
So it was the culture of the home that really valued the written word. And as for dreaming, it depends on the last language I heard. Oh, I can carry on a whole conversation in my dreams, in Russian or in French. I can wake up speaking my version of it because I dreamt and talked in it all night long because that was the last language in my head, or Arabic. Lately, I've been carrying on huge dialogues in Arabic, which are all gobbledygook, obviously, because I don't speak the language, but boy, I spent the entire night speaking it. So, I don't think it's about genetics. It's about what we call nurturing. It's about your surroundings and what you're hearing and what you're seeing.
is another aspect of language also, which is the fact that language is also, it's not just communication, it's not just art, it's not just expression, it's also linked to identity. And that is where, in a sense, lies the rub, because identity is a divisive thing. It separates peoples. It doesn't bring them together. It says, I am me and you are something else. And that is the downside. Because, for example, we were talking about you can publish anywhere today on the net, it's universal. But then again comes that question of a world that is breaking up. It's being broken up into identities that are hostile to one another. And that, I don't think I have an answer to that, but I'm saying it is an aspect of language, unfortunately. The thing is to just go ahead and express it yourself in your own and hope that somebody is listening.
I think to that point of the world being broken up and being divided, and that language has a role to play, I would say that it may not be language that's breaking up us up. It's actually the not being allowed to express ourselves. Expression, when it's suppressed, then changes into a language of rebellion. That if you will not let me express myself and who I am and where I come from and my issues, then I will use my language as a way to separate myself out from you, I think.
I'm conscious that it's 12 o'clock. Have we time for any more questions, or do we need to wrap up? Yeah, there's a question here, and then we'll finish.
My name is Shahid, and my question is inspired from a comment made by Madam Shamsie. She said that, and rightly so, that English is the language of a certain class in this country. Of course, some quality work is being produced by writers of English language here in Pakistan. Don't you think that your fiction, your work should get translated and it should reach out to the people who cannot speak this language? So I don't think enough is being done in this respect.
Well, yes, I entirely agree. I think it should be translated. I mean, this is my great sort of bee in my bonnet. I'm so glad that some work is being translated now, but there has not been enough. And it needs to be done. In India, they're doing much more.
When it comes down to translation, it's also about finding the right kind of translator. Yeah. I would love to translate my own work into Urdu. It'll take me a long time to do it, and I'll have to go back through the basics and understand how to do that. So I might struggle the way you did with your...
But it can be a lot of fun. Just read your own novel back to yourself and tape it in Urdu. And if you can't find the word, then go around it. Go around the word and describe that word. And you'll find that it becomes a richer book.
Even if somebody else was translating my work into Urdu, I would be very conscious about it. I would want to be actively involved in the process. Exactly. So it's not the same as being translated into a language you don't know. So I think it is very important to be translated into the language of your
And I'd like to say that there also needs to be more south-to-south translations that obviates the English language altogether. I've just been publishing a fantastic essay by a young Chinese-American scholar that is about the translation of Ghassan Kanafani. So he went to China and he wrote all about... he was a Marxist, so he was very interested in Mao's China in the 1960s before he was assassinated, and wrote this travel book in Arabic. And she's doing really interesting translation work into Chinese. And so I think that is a whole new world where the West is kind of bypassed altogether. So let's thank our panelists. It's been a fascinating session and you've had so much to say and the questions were great too.